You're listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis, the only podcast focused on the biohealth capital region. Each episode, we'll talk to leaders in the industry to break down the biggest topics happening today in biohealth.
Hi, this is Rich Bendis, your host for BioTalk. I'm also the CEO of BioHealth Innovation, located in Rockville, Maryland. But we have a guest today from the other side of the United States. Actually, the left coast rather than the right coast. We have Lara Mangravite, who is the Executive Director of Digitalis Commons, currently located in San Francisco. And Lara is joining BioTalk for the first time. Lara, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And people are going to say, what is Digitalis Commons? But more importantly, how did you end up getting to Digitalis Commons? So if you don't mind, Lara, let's give the listeners a little bit about your background before we introduce the company that you're working with. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm a pharmaceutical scientist by training, and I've spent my career working on the development of data and software as public goods that can be used across the biomedical research community to advance data science in biology.
Tell us a little bit about your background, though. So how did you get to develop this interest for data and software?
Well, yeah. So as I was finishing my training many, many years ago, I saw the wave coming really past post-human genome of the integration of large-scale data, and particularly data coming from humans rather than from the use of animal models, into biomedicine for target and biomarker discovery, and recognize that we did not have the appropriate infrastructure in place across the community, within our universities, and really also within industry as well, to be able to appropriately advance research using those sorts of new tools. And that really continues to be true even now as these tools advance. Now we're talking about AI and ML. These require a set of infrastructure and data that's not easy to develop within our current system. And so I actually spent the first half of my career at a nonprofit called Sage Bionetworks, which is really focused on addressing these gaps through the development of infrastructure and the socializing of these new practices across the community. I came to Digitalis Commons about 2 years ago as employee number one. And our goal at Digitalis Commons is to fund the unfundable. And so what does that mean? Well, given my background, which is in data and technology for public good, I partnered with Jeff Smith, who is the head of Digitalis. So he runs our sister organization, Digitalis Ventures, which of course is a VC, but founded the nonprofit Digitalis Commons as a way to address the many important technologies that we need in the health sector that are just not a good fit for our current systems. And that includes VC funding. VCs have a very narrow focus on what they will fund, but also the infrastructure I'm talking about that actually doesn't fit in our system as well.
Super. So you really have a merger of nonprofit and this for-profit world coming together, Jeff and you, right? And being employee number one, you got a chance to shape Digitalis Commons, I would imagine, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So you started with a clean sheet of paper, and when you got done with that sheet of paper 2 years ago, talk a little bit about what you said is the mission, and is the mission the same 2 years later than when you envisioned this a couple years ago? And how it fits into this evolving biomedical research ecosystem that we have that's constantly changing now.
Yeah. Well, so the mission remains the same, fund the unfundable. I guess the challenge and opportunity of any new organization is trying to decide how you're actually going to get to that mission. And I'd say that has evolved for sure. So the first, call it vertical, that we developed at the Commons is actually a set of advisory practices, so business consulting to support folks building health technologies that are taking non-traditional paths. So we can pull together the vast network of senior experts we know through our VC connections and then through my own, call them public good connections. And we've combined that with an internal team of analysts who can go out and support any funder or founder who's thinking about advancing a technology and needs to think through how they're actually going to get this to maximum capacity, whether that's getting it to patients or to research, whoever their end user is. Quite tangibly, that's looked like us working with a couple of foundational partners, ARPA-H, which is a federal research funding agency, and the Wellcome Trust, which is a philanthropy based in the UK, to help support their translational research portfolios in making sure they actually get past that initial, call them startup funds, and off into the world.
So basically, two of your partners have the money that funds the unfundable, potentially, but some of the others that are unfundable become fundable based on the work that's been done, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's really hard, as you well know, to make that leap from government or philanthropic funding to commercial funding, whether that's a corporate partnership or some other sort of investment.
Right.
And so we help these initial funders both solicit, procure, and manage the portfolio of awardees with the business sense in mind. So if you've got the best technologist in the world in a particular area, we can bring in the business acumen to say, hey, let's shape this or consider the following design specs that you're actually going to need to be able to get this to move forward. And that can be a very standard commercial path, like with a medical device or a therapeutic, just starting to think about those development and commercialization requirements a little bit early on before you leave the nest. But it also looks like other sorts of products that these various funders are looking to advance. So that might be a big data set or some sort of technological infrastructure, a clinical trial network, these sorts of things that don't have a clear path beyond their initial bolus of funding, but really need to live on to have their maximum output. It could also look like something with more of a public service angle. So certainly the Wellcome Trust is very interested in developing early interventions for mental health and getting them broadly accessible in low and middle income countries. And so that has a very different sort of path than a more traditional commercial entity.
So that would mean you have a very diversified portfolio of clients or
Yes.
performers, as they're referred to. And that might be an emerging entrepreneur, an established business. It could be an academic researcher. It could be a bench scientist somewhere with an idea, but doesn't know whether it's commercializable or not. Can you explain a little bit the typical client that you have, even though there isn't one specific type of client you might have?
Yeah, so you're right. It could be any one of those sorts of individuals. Typically, we shine when we're working with someone who doesn't know the path themselves. So they aren't a serial entrepreneur, as an example, or they've built their first company or nonprofit and they're trying to figure out how to make it sustainable, or they're trying to figure out how to make it scale. And so we can come in and provide any level of support to those. Sometimes it's just a conversation to help guide them in that direction. It can go all the way through to giving them boots on the ground operational support where needed.
Right. So you're the business side to the science,
That's exactly.
basically. Okay. You did a recent article, and we actually got to publish it, which is the notes on catalyzing health. And what you tried to describe, or you did describe, was a dramatic shift in how science is being funded in the United States. And basically, how do you believe that that dramatic change that's happening today, first of all, talk about why it's happening and what the outcomes are from that change that's occurring in the way that science is being funded today?
Yeah, absolutely. So You'd have to be living under a rock not to recognize that there's been a lot of changes in 2025 in the United States. Federal policy is changing dramatically in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways that it is changing is in the federal policy on the funding of science. So we are seeing movements towards a reduction in funding and a shift in funding priorities. Over the last 80 years, there's been a tight coupling of universities and the federal science funding agencies, such that universities and the scientists within are really very much focused on procuring funding for their scientific endeavors, predominantly from the federal government. So when you see this shift, we're starting to look at a decoupling of those two pieces. Now, I think that there's lots to be concerned about there, particularly with the reduction in funding, right? We're going to see a scale back in science. But I do think there's also opportunity as well, right? Because many universities and many scientists within universities right now are so focused on federal funding, which looks and feels a certain way and funds a very certain kind of science at the expense of other types of science. So what do I mean by that? And this is totally colored by, my own background, but I see how incredibly difficult it is to do large scale data projects or technology projects in the paradigm of how federal funding has been applied. And so I think that there is an opportunity moving forward as we diversify our funding sources to also diversify scientific outcomes and the goals of that science.
Right. And people who are more nimble and flexible are the ones that are going to be able to survive through these changes, right, Lara?
That's absolutely right. You always want to diversify your portfolio, right? You think about that on the commercial side, but I think that's going to be true for university scientists as well.
One of the things you talked about in your paper was decentralization. Talk a little bit about what that really means for science and what your definition of decentralization is as it relates to life science funding and research.
Yeah, and I think it's both of those sides sort of separately and then coming together, right? We're going to see a much broader suite of funders advancing their own research agendas. And so, again, I think that that can be really exciting in some ways, but it does risk losing some of what we currently have, the kind of national scientific strategy, which really is set by scientists across the country, but through the NIH, right? And as that goes away, as the National Academies of Science slowly unwind, the question is, where are we going to set national science policy? And how might you then integrate funds coming from multiple places together into that broader scientific agenda? I'm not sure that we will. We may just find that each individual funder has their own very specific and sometimes quite narrow scientific set of goals, and they're going to go deep there, and we may end up with broad gaps in what science is being done between these things. So that's what I see for the decentralization on the funding side. On the research side, I think we're going to start to see more of a proliferation of research institutes outside of the university setting.
And yeah, that's something that you had talked also about in your paper, and we're going to talk about that. Before I go there, though, you really have the benefit of seeing what Jeff Smith with Digitalis Ventures is doing and how he has to be shift, as well as what you're doing with Digitalis Commons and the shifts that you have to make related to these changes that are going on. And I would imagine we're talking about potentially going from 47 billion to 27 billion, even though it's not happened yet with the NIH, but losing $20 billion that really is funding fundamental science and research in the United States, where we're the innovation leader, and dramatically decreasing that and going potentially from 27 institutes to 8 research institutes in NIH just at the beginning, changes dramatically. So how do you and Jeff compare notes on what he's seen in the changes and the implications that's going on. And you're living it daily as well with the clients you're working with ARPA-H and with Burroughs Wellcome. So talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is interesting to watch the changes on both sides. To date, they remain somewhat separate. So on the venture side, there's more going on than just the changes in policy. And primarily they're focused on FDA regulation this year. But we're coming off of this post-pandemic economic shift that's really been very difficult for venture to navigate. So decreased investment already in biotech, and then this increase in risk, or even at this point, maybe just perceived risk, is problematic and is causing even less investment. So we look at that and we think, okay, what can the commons do? Because we're focused a little earlier in the life cycle of science. And the best strategy we can have is to provide tools and resources to further de-risk on the biological side and hope that that helps push some of this a little bit forward.
Well, I guess the key is that if you look at where you're focused, it's really early stage, and venture capital is going to more clinical stage because they have to decrease the risk and try to find a way to generate returns for their investors these days, and that's getting a little more difficult. So, yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. You're at the front end, and he's more at the back end, and in the middle, sometimes you meet.
Yeah, I mean, you just touched on something that is absolutely happening right now, which is ventures moving more and more towards later stage investments, right? Where things have to be pretty far into clinical development before they'll get touched. And with the reduction in funds on the front end, there's going to be a bigger and bigger gap in between, right? It's going to be harder for things to shift.
The innovation capital gap has just gotten wider.
Yes, exactly. We love to think about alternatives to cover that gap, right? In the remit of fund the unfundable, what could happen in there? I can't say that I have any good solutions for that particular problem yet, but I do think there are folks who are thinking about creative ways to address that when that's just going to have to happen. We're going to
have to happen. And one of the things you talk about, though, is the rise of independent research institutes might be one of those alternatives. And so what do you think makes that model more appealing these days? And give us some examples of independent research institutes that you see are stepping up, maybe where there's a need for them now more than ever. And people need to get in touch with what these independent research institutes are, who they are, what their investment philosophies are.
Yeah, absolutely. So increasingly over the last dozen years, I'd say, we've been watching this trend where new philanthropists, as they turn their eye towards funding science, choose more and more to do so not through a university, but actually by building their own research institute, right? So gone are the days of last century where you donate a huge amount of money to your favorite university and they build a building or a center and put your name on it, and you trust them to appropriately administer those funds. We're increasingly now seeing philanthropists who have a very clear goal in mind and recognize that in order for them to have sufficient control over how the science is done, they're going to have to build a different type of research institution to do so. And it really is when one is focused on building out products or outcomes that don't look and feel like the traditional scientific output. That is the pursuit of scientific knowledge for the sake of scientific knowledge. And I see that in two different directions, right? It's folks who are trying to build infrastructure as public goods. So actually an old example is the Allen Institutes, created by Paul Allen 20 years ago, entirely focused on distribution of data as public resources under the rubric that that will lift many scientists and advance the whole field. And we see that increasingly happening. So a more recent example is the CZI biohubs. So these are actually multiple institutions created by CZI, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and they are very explicitly focused on advancing research in a new scientific field and doing so by creating new technology. Often this is imaging technology or analytical methodology, and putting them openly into the open domain for anyone to use. So they both fund science, but actually they're funding the development of scientific technology to advance the field. And that is really hard to do in a university setting.
And how do you see these institutes, independent institutes, Gates and Scripps and all of these other people funding this research, since NIH has sort of been the gold standard with the research grants that they've been doing, and everybody has been accustomed to getting their direct overhead rates that have been built into these grants? How do these independent research institutes deal with some of the issues that the academic institutions are having to deal and researchers are dealing with today? Are they more flexible? Are they more nimble? Are they willing to be flexible in working with these researchers in order to achieve the institute's goals and their missions? How do you see their philosophies evolving?
Yeah, super interesting to watch that. So I've had the pleasure of working at two independent research institutions in my career, and both of them worked to be very flexible in where funds came from and how they could accommodate that. And actually, often that's very appealing to a certain kind of scientist, because frequently a university will not allow you to take funds from non-federal sources when it comes with such a different set of strings or conditions and doesn't fit into their normal strategy. Having said that, traditionally it's been quite expensive to run a research institute. And so many of the independent research institutes from last century have very high overhead rates, and they're really going to struggle with those changes. But actually, particularly as we move into data science, I see a future where much of the infrastructure you need to run a research institute can be either virtual or it can be developed using existing commercial products, for example, for data management and generation. You don't need to have your own genomics core anymore. You can just samples out to a company who will generate data that is just as good. And so I think that means that there's great flexibility for overhead rates, et cetera, to really be reduced greatly. But you have to do that sort of with an upfront strategy in mind. So I guess short answer, some of the existing research institutes will have to pivot necessarily, but I expect there will be a proliferation of new ones that are built explicitly with these new conditions in mind.
Gotcha. Yeah, and then, definitely dealing in the AI, machine learning, quantum area has a totally different infrastructure need than what you're dealing with when you're trying to develop a biologic or a therapeutic. And one of the things you also have mentioned is that universities aren't really digital native, and they're really not as digital savvy. So talk a little bit about what you mean by that and what
Yeah.
the challenges are for them.
Yeah. So I think for any entity seeking to do, call it data intensive science, whatever flavor of that they're looking at, there are a couple key things you need to be able to do that well. I think first and foremost, you need an interdisciplinary team. It's not just the best scientist in the world. You need multiple scientists. You need, for example, the biologist who deeply understands the nature of the biology that you're trying to model. You need the data scientists who actually understand the methodologies, but you also need a team of other folks, data scientists, data curators, software engineers, who are not traditionally either well compensated or well appreciated at universities. So it's very hard to make the right team in a university to do this sort of work. On top of that, there's shifts in incentive structures. So even at a university where you have a top biologist working with a top computational scientist, they may be incentivized to work together on a common problem, but they're each actually trying to produce something slightly different, right? The biologist is trying to identify new biology, and the computational scientist or analyst is trying to develop new methods for analysis, right? And those are related, but they are not the same. And so it can be difficult because you're really not jointly focused on the same output. And then there's the infrastructure problem, right? Like universities are often building their own data infrastructure when really these days the best data infrastructure in the world is being built in the commercial sector. And so it can be hard to pull that in as well. So you sort of put all those things together, and data science just ends up being bolted on to the existing university system. I guess one more point I would make there is that a university actually does many, many, many things. They provide value through their teaching. They often have medical centers. They have the research. They have all sorts of different kinds of researchers they need to build the infrastructure to support. And so it's hard for them to really make the decisions that are best for their data scientists when they have all of these other competing priorities and other groups that they need to be supporting as well.
Yeah, I think also one of the things that you've talked about is really the fragmentation that's happening right now. But when you look at things that traditionally have been underfunded, women's health or pediatric or rare diseases, and you see significant cuts coming from the federal government, who funded some of that, but not all that was needed. Is this an opportunity, or is it going to be a greater challenge right now with the independent research institutes, with the commercial players, big pharma, big bio, medical device companies, being willing to fund these really underprivileged disease groups or categories, which don't have the big grand slam or home runs opportunities for the investors to invest in? So what do you see happening in that dynamic now, Lara?
Yeah, we are deeply concerned about that. Again, under the rubric of funding the unfundable, we are looking at trying to predict what we think might happen there and how we might be able to nudge it forward. I think in this world we're moving into with this patchwork of funders, any individual research domain, for example, women's health, is really going to need a champion with a large pocketbook in order to be able to advance their research. Women's health is an area we've been looking at. There has traditionally been lower investment on the VC side in women's health. There are multiple reasons, all of which are perceived as impacting the risk profile of that sort of investment. And one of them is a lack of understanding of the underlying biology. And so investment in research to uncover those biological truths and de-risk the entire sector, I think, is going to be really important. And it's only going to happen if a single funder, or probably more appropriately, a network of funders, decide that this is where they want to focus their money. And so I think that there's a fair amount of advocacy that needs to be done and partnership to move that forward.
Let's talk about talent a little bit. Basically, the United States has been a leader in talent. And now, if you look at potentially significant cuts in federal funding, which impacts people at the federal research institutes as well as the academic research institutes, where we really had, I wouldn't say an excess, but we had talent to cover almost every discipline, disease, or research area where you had a need. Now you have whole departments, you have whole institutes that are disappearing. What's going to happen to this talent leadership in America, and where do these very talented people go to continue their careers?
This is a great and unknowable question. I do think we're going to see, again, the rise of other sorts of institutions that fall between the university and the corporate world. And there is great opportunity there. However, it's not going to be sufficient to leverage all of the talent that's going to be available. I don't know, right? We are seeing folks start to move internationally, and that's frankly terrifying, right? We're losing talent, but I think it's kind of inevitable in the direction we're going. We're just seeing a downsizing in the overall community.
So since you have a chance to look at both sides, give us a little bit of your words of wisdom and advice you would give to the emerging entrepreneurs in the life science and biohealth world, as well as the postdocs and the emerging researchers who have great ideas right now. What kind of advice can you give those people?
Yeah, I think the advice is to be flexible, right? To throw away the paradigms you've learned before about where to go for funding and what is expected there, and look for alternative sources of capital where you may even be able to help guide what those parameters look like. I see that within the university, and I'm seeing that increasingly as folks come out of the university, that if you're able to be flexible in how and where you want to perform science, you may very well be able to find something actually pretty unique and quite different, a new opportunity, call it.
Yeah. So flexibility is key. And we're talking with Lara Mangravite, who's the executive director of Digitalis Commons. And Lara, we talked about a bunch of things here today, and it's not all gloom and doom. There are opportunities and there are areas for growth here within the United States. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you believe the listeners of BioTalk would like to hear right now?
I think I would just say there is a new paradigm coming, and we don't know exactly what it looks like, but there's going to be an opportunity for those who are open for it. So keep your eyes open.
Yeah, I guess the key is some of the people can help design the new paradigm. So it's not what other people do. I guess open up your minds to see what you can do to help design what the new paradigm is going to look like in the future. And I think one of the biggest challenges is NIH has been sort of in the leadership position. So if they're not the leader, where's the new leader going to evolve? Is it going to be a more decentralized form of leadership in this research and the science field? Or is the industry going to have a much bigger role? Are they willing to step up? Are there other forms of government, maybe state or local government, that need to step up where the federal government is leaving gaps? So I don't have the answers. You don't have the answers, but the answers are out there to really be discovered, really.
Right, in real time. And everything you just mentioned, I see happening. I see state governments stepping up. I see regional governments stepping up. I see corporations stepping up. I see philanthropists getting involved. Again, it's not going to cover the gap in totality. And the one thing I continually hear from those folks is, I don't want to just fund the thing that you just had defunded. I have my own research priorities and my own research agenda, and I'm looking to advance that. So again, I think that scientists who can hear that and start to think about how they would help support that are going to get the opportunity to really lead where we're going.
Well, I think, Lara, this will be an interesting discussion to have 6 months from now. So let's monitor what changes occur and what control of our own destiny that we have, and come back and visit again in the fall and see how the industry has changed, where leaders have evolved, what new independent research institutes are being created to help fill some of these gaps. But I think having another discussion with Lara Mangravite, the executive director of Digitalis Commons, who's been with us on BioTalk today, will be very interesting as we look future into 2025. So Lara, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to BioTalk with Rich Bendis.